Chapter 101, The Eternal Sleep. Good day everyone, my name is Stephen Grant and I thank you all for coming, but I assume none of you want your time wasted, so let's go straight to the point. Steve began. Using the upcoming raid as a point, Steve immediately introduced his company, without stating even one thing concerning his new position as the country's second national level hunter. However, do not be mistaken, arcane technology is just as much a life giver as it helps take them. We introduce you all to our elixir series, Steve said as the background image changed and the crowd seemed to move closer to him. Their interests were clearly evident, and Steve could tell that easily. If there was anything about the rich and powerful, it's that they always find a way to extend their lifespan. I am now hearing from a national level craftsman, telling them about an elixir. They naturally went to such a space. Of course, as of now, they may not grant you immortality but they are still good. The first being our mana elixir. Unlike in video games, these don't refill your mana but they can help revive someone who has fallen to the eternal sleep, Steve said as calmly and as clearly as possible. As soon as his voice fell, he heard a great noise rise into the room. Steve could see the eyes of nearly every businessman in the room light up. He also saw the look of renewed hope in the eyes of many who were present. This was the effect he wanted. He was here for the profits but he was also here to help. That came with its own moral benefits that were way more superior to just the wealth that would be gained. With his abilities, wealth could be gained just by making anything. The rest of the event was simply him announcing some of their products and its effects. Of course, he did not go into full detail but it was enough for all to wonder what sort of powerhouse Arcane Technologies was. With that I say, thank you all and I hope to see you all there, after we have sent those ants to hell, Steve said before flashing a smile and leaving the stage. His time was up so he quickly turned and left the stage. As soon as he came down, he saw a swarm of businessmen approaching him, only to be stopped by a combination of Judy and the other hunters who were present for protective duties. Did you really create such a drug? Gun-hee asked as he passed by him. You know me, what do you think? Steve replied. He had created it but for now, he had yet to test it on a human. However, as far as testing goes, it had been tested well enough, and Judy was in charge of that. She had taken the drug and noted every single effect it had on the human body. Apparently, she could manipulate and shift her physical body in any way she felt necessary. I'd like to see it later, Gun-hee said before climbing up the stage. Chapter 102, Jeju Island. Almost as soon as he sat back down, he was immediately crowded by the many businessmen who all wanted to quickly associate themselves with him. The rest of the event went peacefully. It was a fundraiser and Gun-hee was surprisingly excellent at manipulating rich people to get what he wanted. At the end of the event, about 100 million won were raised, which sounded like a lot of money until you discover that that's about 73,000 US dollars. It was a surprisingly small amount of money. However, who was Gun-hee to complain about it? Steve himself didn't even understand why a fundraiser was being done when he would be providing all the equipment used. The association didn't need that much money. Well, they were partnering with the Japanese hunters. They needed to pay way more hunters than they normally would, so this was sort of understandable but not needed. So, Steve simply thought of this as a PR move. Gun-hee called for the fundraiser to simply raise the standing of the Hunter Association. The association was respected but compared to the guilds, it was nothing. Sir, we have a new tail, how would you like me to deal with them? Judy suddenly asked while in the car. I don't care, just don't kill them, Steve replied as he focused on the road. Almost as soon as he gave his permission, Judy disappeared from her seat and looking back, Steve could see several souls dimming down. They were not dead but the dimness of their souls suggested that they were close to it, which meant two things. She was either knocking them down, as the closest one gets to death on a daily basis is sleep, or she was beating them up and leaving them near death. Either way, it wasn't any of his problems nor was it any of hers. Seconds later, Judy reappeared and the two made their way back home. Floating high in the sky, several news helicopters could be seen. Each one pointed their cameras towards a small boat that was speeding forward. However, none moved from their position, rather, they simply continued to zoom to keep up with them. Below them were several ships, each one equipped with several high-power guns. They may not be effective against the monsters that they are about to fight. However, God knows that they had no choice. Before the three parties, it was a large island, covering an area of more than 1,800 square kilometers, a place that was once filled with people and all sorts of life, now laid bare and barren. Jeju Island had long since become a desert. The ants had eaten everything in sight, leaving concrete and dirt behind. I never thought you would come, Gun-hee spoke as he stood on one of the many destroyers and frigates that were present. This is a great field test of the commercially produced combat suits and the gate barrier. I have to be here, Steve replied with his eyes fixed on the island. He wasn't cleared for action so he couldn't do anything. This was the one thing he had learned about national level hunters. To the public, they seemed to have the ability to do whatever they wanted. Chapter 103, Gate Barrier. Which was true to some extent, however, in reality, they were essentially a military asset for the government. His duty here was the same as Gun-hee's, watch over the hunters and ensure that no ant leaves the island. Apparently, any member of this species of ant could evolve into a queen if even one were left to escape. It was a scary thought. These ants were really the perfect creatures for a hostile takeover or to drive a helpless race to extinction. They could evolve, and they did so at a pace that could only be described as terrifying. The island had far more A-rank creatures on it than when he first visited to scan the island. If any of them should escape and succeed in their mission, that ant could then go to a hidden location and evolve into a new queen. That would automatically promote it to the higher ranks of S rank. Most of its eggs would hatch to be A rank, and on the rare but still frequent occasion, an S rank would emerge. He had to respect the design. Steve was impressed by how effective it would have been if humanity weren't, well, human. He and the old man stood and watched as the main party of hunters finally arrived at the shores of the island. Hello, this is Hunter Kyoto Ryaji. Can you all hear me? Steve heard a voice through the comms. We can hear you here and are ready, Steve replied. We hear you and are ready, another voice said through the line. Truthfully, a normal communication network would have worked just fine, but the island could now be considered a dungeon of its own. It was saturated with mana, so normal equipment wouldn't work, hence, his earpieces had to be put to use. The communication tests continued for a while before the actual mission began. To all hunters present, please ensure that all equipment, both offensive and defensive, is in good condition before you proceed. You are about to enter the gate barrier, Steve suddenly said. Acknowledged, a voice replied. Hearing that, Steve simply nodded. Others may not be able to see it, but he could see it clear as day. The mana formed what looked like a dome over the entire island. This was a prototype of his, but it seemed to be working fine. The government may have rejected his request to take care of the ants so they could create a connection with the Japanese hunters. You know, politics over the actual safety of the people. However, they had requested and paid a good amount of money for him to create something that could prevent the ants from leaving the island, even if it was only temporarily. With Judy's help, this was designed. It absorbed energy from the dungeon itself to strengthen itself and was designed to recognize and allow humans to enter and pass as freely as they wanted. Do you think they can make it? Gunhee suddenly asked. Their chances are much higher than mine were within the red gate, Steve replied. Chapter 104, Raid. That much he knew, but he also knew that, unlike them, he could create a lot of weaponry and helpers that made bridging the gap between classes much easier. He had literally killed what he now knew as a disaster or national level monster with just a sniper. These people truthfully had more experience than him. After all, he had only been a hunter for about 6 months, maximum even if you are counting the time spent within the red gate. Okay then, Gunhee replied. Normally no one should have a good view of what was going on within the dungeon. However, the hunter cam was online and streaming. In front of them was a large holographic screen and on it were about 20 different camera views. Each one belonged to a hunter on the island. From the view it provided, Steve and Mr. Gunhee were able to watch and guide the team a bit. They all watched as the hunters cleared ant after ant with each. Majority of them were S-ranked. The other few were very high-ranking A rank, so they could hold their own against most of the monsters they faced, and their duty wasn't to be the main attack force. They were backup and that was all. They were meant to be the one who ensures that no ant leaves the island. They were the first line of defense. As soon as they arrived on the island, Steve saw and sensed a great movement within the main gate as the ants immediately became active. Thousands of them could be seen rushing out of their resting place as they all rushed the people. The battle had begun. Following already established strategies, the hunters went to work. They were very well practiced and now with even better weapons and armor that made it possible for a combat-based B rank to fight on PAR with one of the ants. It wasn't just a clearing, the hunters were completely slaughtering the ants. The ants, however, had the number advantage to their side. The hunters who were once on the winning side slowly began to get overwhelmed. Thankfully, they had better protection than normal so they could withstand way more blows and not die, while the many A ranks and some of the S rank hunters did their duty of keeping the main horde of ants away from the queen. The main attack group consisted of Cha Harin, Baek Yuno, Choi Jong-in, Ma Dongwook, Lim Tae-jae and Min Byung-jae. They were all the Korean main raid party. Kyoto Ryaji and his team were to secure the immediate outskirts of the main gate while the Korean team cleared it. It divided the power the teams could muster, but it was still a very effective plan. One, he didn't approve of. Like he had said earlier, there were 2 national level monsters on that island. He didn't know why the 2 had yet to make a move, but even so, he knew that this raid would end badly. He had created everything that should grant them a greater chance at survival. Hours passed as the hunters held their stand against the overwhelming numbers. High above in the skies, the newslet spawned captivating stories that kept the hopes of the people up. Meanwhile, Steve and the chairman simply remained standing and watching. They could both tell how bad this truly was and were ready to take action if necessary. Not just him though, Steve could also sense a certain someone had made plans for the very same reason. Chapter 105, The Queen. On the large frigate, the 2 men could be seen standing and watching the event unfold in the distance. The ants used their number to overwhelm the hunters greatly, but thankfully, there was yet to be any death. On the side of the main attack party, Steve had long since prepared a massive holographic screen which was used to view their battle through the tunnels to the queen. The team advanced swiftly, ignoring all ants they could and quickly dispatching those that obstructed their mission. Everything seems to be proceeding well, Gunhee said after a while as he sat in a provided chair behind him. They have yet to meet the queen, so we can't say for sure, Steve replied as he too took a seat. Their duty was to eliminate all ants that may try to escape from Jeju Island, but the barrier that Steve set up was working wonders. You can sense it, right? Gunhee suddenly asked. It's hatching, Steve replied with a grim expression on his face. This was a whole new thing of its own. He hadn't exactly investigated the island well. He had just gotten the general power level of the creatures and had created a training simulation based on that. He hadn't actually seen the 2 national level monsters he had been warning them about. He didn't want to push his luck. He may be way more powerful now, probably more so than even a national level hunter. However, he wasn't one to go test his lick against 2 monsters that are nearly on PAR with him. Now things were a bit more different than he expected. The monsters just hatched. These were ants that evolved at speed visible to the human eye, and yet, there were 2 of them that just hatched and had power that completely dwarfed that of the S ranks. If they let it live, it will eventually continue to evolve and just like the rest of the ants, evolve and grow significantly more powerful. Within the tunnels to the queen, the main raid party could be seen running towards where they sensed the most energy. Usually that was where the queen was. They had learned that, the hard way during the simulations. Cha Hayan. Baek Yuno shouted as he immediately dived towards her. Before she could understand what was going on, a loud bang was heard as they all saw Baek Yuno holding one of the ants by the throat. It was dead, but the message was very clear in their minds. It meant that some of the ants had developed some form of stealth techniques. Each one doubled their level of caution as they had no real idea what they might face within these tunnels. Their battle continued as they progressed and soon they came upon a large opening. It was a space as big as a football field, normal. There weren't that many ants within the space, but they could see a hefty amount of webs and ant eggs. All of them sensed an extra presence within the large room. It was the queen. She's big, Min Byungjae noted as they slowly walked into the large room. Choi Jong-in, lighted up, Ma Dong-wook said as they all prepared for the chaos that was about to ensue. Without much hesitation, the redhead unleashed a large magic circle as flames overtook the entire cave. Chapter 106, National Level Monster. Screech. The queen screamed in pain. The webs burned quickly and soon the eggs followed, standing no chance against the enchanted flames. With the queen descending into madness, Baek-yuno and Choi Young-in immediately began to unleash their attacks on it. If the simulations had taught them anything, it was that they should never give the queen time to calm down. Don't let it recover. Baek-yuno shouted before his body suddenly glowed and he grew bigger. His claws became more pronounced, the fur on his body also grew longer. Behind him in the distance, Choi Young-in could be seen covered in flames as every artifact on his body boosted his mana recovery. Flame spell after flame spell filled the space, but their suits offered protection from the flames and fumes. Cha Hae-in could be seen in front with her body glowing golden, her sword brightly lit as she unleashed slash after slash. They didn't want to know how powerful the creature was, they planned to take full advantage of what they had to completely eradicate this new threat. Its vital signs are dwindling, Min Byungjae said, alerting the entire team to their progress. With that announcement, the team immediately increased their attacks. None relented until the overwhelmed creature was lying on the ground dead. It's dead, Min Byungjae asked. Looking at the queen, the team couldn't believe it. They had done it. They killed the queen. They had finally avenged the deaths on Jeju Island, all those years ago. Something's off, Baek-yuno noted. His eyes glowing golden as he continued staring at the corpse. He didn't know why, but this felt a bit too easy. Normally he would dismiss it as them being too overgeared or that they had overtrained for the situation. However, he, just like every hunter in the room, had heard the craftsman, Mr. Grant, explain the simulation to the chairman. The simulation only had about 83% of the original strength, and even worse, the tactics they were fighting against was one the craftsman had simulated from normal ants going to war with neighboring ant colonies. This was definitely too easy. He could tell this much. Screech. It's definitely more powerful than I anticipated, Steve remarked to the chairman as he stood up from his seat. How can one monster have so much power? Gun-hee asked as he too could feel the massive amount of mana. It was just as Steve had said, the monster was definitely more powerful than he anticipated. Of course, comparing it to monsters within Baron's dungeon, he could say it was on par with the UT Jin. It had the same ridiculous amount of mana to the extent that their mana affected their physical environment. They stood a chance with their suits and weapons, but it wouldn't help them much. I never thought I would see a monster with this sort of power outside that red gate. This world just keeps getting interesting, Steve noted before vanishing. Chapter 107, Hunter Sung Jin Woo. He had once stated that he could sense 2 national level monsters and one had just come out. The other still remained hidden for some reason. If it was so, then he needed to intervene. This particular ant, he believed the hunters would be able to handle. He may term it as national level, but truthfully it was only close to such level. He believed that the hunters should be able to handle it, and even if they couldn't, a certain someone had made reservations to intervene. Reappearing on the island, Steve found himself on the far end of the island. The area was somewhat barren save for some shrubs and damaged buildings. Sensibly no life should exist here, but he could sense a massive source of mana here. Now that he was here, it seemed to come from hundreds of people all at once, but he could sense it from the direction. Judy. Steve called out. Sir, Judy replied. Is it one of them? Steve asked. Yes, Sir, Judy replied as Steve's expression changed massively. His smile faded as the suit he had on immediately burned to a crisp, revealing the combat suit beneath. He had always suspected that one of the so-called monarchs existed on the island. Therefore he was prepared to face off against such a threat. After his battle with Baron, he had stuck to not only growing his strength and influence but to massively upgrade his equipment. So what monarch are you? Steve asked openly as he sat on one of the concrete boulders in the area. There was no one physically before him, but he could definitely sense its presence. It was different and ever-changing. From their presence, he could tell that their power wasn't the same. Baron's aura felt too much like being in nature and warm. Now that he thought about it, it brought some level of calm and peace as well as happiness for some reason. Of course, such feeling was to an excessive degree that his head hurt. Only his situation at that moment saved him from falling to the monarch's aura. Now it was as though he was facing up against an entire army in one. The aura was ever-changing. One moment, it was like that of a normal artifact, and another, it was similar to his. Is that your mojo? Baron ruled over the elements and you rule over evolution, or what? Steve asked again. He may not be confident in many things, but he was definitely confident in his strength. Change. A new voice. Voices? Was heard as Steve saw what looked like a gate appear before him. Out of it walked a weird-looking being. It had no definite shape, nor did it have a definite look. So everything that is not constant then. Steve replied as he stood up. At the same time, he could sense a new presence within the Ant Queen's chambers. It was Hunter Sung Jin Woo. His presence meant that the hunters weren't winning at all. Are you worried about your people? The monarch asked. That is a constant. They are my first customers after all. So what exactly is your purpose on my planet? Your planet. This wood has never been yours. Your kind is nothing but an interruption that we shall get rid of soon. So says the Amoeba. Chapter 108, The Pagoda. You pride yourself in your mere strength, but you have yet to see the true upper limits of power. Brother, you are barely above that ant back there, Steve noted. The ant was very close to the national level rank, and this monarch could be said to be at that level. He could sense that this creature was definitely like Baron, but somehow it didn't have the sort of power that matched Baron at all. Your kind truly are clueless, mere puppets in this cosmic game. Okay, no, I'm just going to stop you there. I didn't come here for some kind of philosophical argument. You are trespassing on my planet. I don't care if you are a monarch or a god, you have two options, leave or die, Steve stated. He understood for a fact that this creature or monarch was definitely more powerful than it let on, but he was now way more powerful than before. He hadn't just stayed behind and watched the hunters kill the ants. He needed their souls. He had also helped in several dungeon breaks, though minor ones, and had never entered a gate after he came out of the red gate. But he was now roughly twice as powerful. Of course, he didn't know how much that would matter against a full-powered monarch. However, he also understood that there was no way for it to kill him. Leave or die, the creature said before its shapeless form began to take a humanoid shape. It was as large as 3 meters tall, had 2 extra arms below the regular ones, and had a body that he could only describe as pure muscle. At the same time, its once low levels of mana seemed to triple and continued to grow even larger. This was on a whole different level compared to Baron. Their surroundings shook and parted. Impressive, Steve replied nonchalantly. However, he immediately began to channel his mana. He didn't know what he was about to face. The creature immediately lunged at him at a speed he had difficulty keeping up with. I disagree, Steve heard a voice say from behind him and, without much thought, he immediately jumped away. This would be a lot more difficult than he initially thought it would be. The monarch didn't let up either, immediately following after him. Judy, I'll be needing some assistance here, Steve called out as he flipped away from another attack. What would you be needing, sir? Judy replied. Send the burning pagoda. It's not complete, sir. The effects may be disastrous to both you and the hunters on the island, Judy warned. Not with him around, Steve replied before suddenly vanishing from sight. With a new weapon in sight, Steve immediately went on the offensive. With his suit activated and increasing his power beyond what it already was, Steve was more than on par with the creature. However, he could tell that the creature wasn't using its full power yet, but who was he to not utilize this advantage? Burning pagoda incoming, Judy suddenly said as Steve saw several large portals open high in the sky. Chapter 109, Suppression. Immediately, he felt an almost instantaneous connection to whatever it was on the other side, directing it as well as he could. At the same time, he weaved and dodged through every single one of the monarch's attacks. He had long since realized he had no actual way of beating the monstrosity before him. Baron may have been a powerful monarch as well, but he was not at full power. He had barely been resurrected, and Steve had capitalized on that fact. He couldn't do the same to this Goro-looking guy. It had no such weakness to take advantage of. Its power seemed to grow based on will, and its form wasn't stable. One moment, he was fighting against a humanoid monster. The next, he was battling a giant creature. You can't dodge forever, the monarch said before leaping high into the air. Yes, I can. Shit. Steve replied as he immediately jumped into the air as well. Boom! A loud explosion was heard as the monarch, now the size of a whale or probably bigger, landed on the island. The ground shook as the island itself nearly sank, but Steve was high up in the air and not affected. Waving his hand in a downward motion, 3 large torii gates fell out of the massive portal Judy had created. Using the creature's new massive size and clear lack of fighting ability to his advantage, the torii gates immediately slammed down, entrapping the monarch under them. As soon as they connected with the ground, Steve felt a whole new kind of energy wave fill the lands as all became quiet. What is this? The monarch called out as the dust finally cleared away. Now it was all revealed. The monarch was still there but now smaller and in its original form, which was that of an amoeba. The torii gates, which were once big, had somehow adjusted their size but remained on top of the monarch. Above all, the area around now seemed completely devoid of all life. The once tall grass had shriveled and died, and the trees were broken and dry. There may have been no animals or humans on the island, but plants flourished. However, now there seemed to be none of that. They were all gone, dried up. Damn. Judy, are you recording this? Steve asked. Every minute of it, sir. However, it would seem my help may not be needed anymore. Yes, but stay. I have a feeling more will come to save him or something, Steve replied. He may have won this battle, but it wasn't because he was strong enough to win it. Rather, it was because the opponent had probably never seen battle before. It was overconfident and used its power wildly. It lacked any form of true combat ability. That much could be seen in the fact that he wasn't dead yet. It was way faster, stronger, but still he was here unscathed. If another monarch or something on that level arrived, God knows he wouldn't survive. What is this? Sorcery? The monarch asked with an obvious strain in its tone. It was obvious that the torii was working well. Maybe a little too well, but who was he to complain? The torii was built to suppress or, more accurately, absorb any and all energy within a given target. It was one of his latest creations, one he had created to battle the young hunter. It was made to absorb soul energy. Just a little bit of engineering and ingenuity. In about 2 to 5 minutes, they will drain you of all your energy. Neat, right? Steve answered proudly. He knew they worked, but not this well, and he was glad that it was so. This isn't over, mortal, the monarch began, only to be cut off by a jet of powerful flames. Using his powers, Steve burnt the creature out of existence. He didn't go through all this trouble just to listen to some villain monologue. Is it dead? Steve asked, unsure. He didn't exactly know how things worked for these monarchs. Last time, he fought against one that had just resurrected, so maybe death didn't hold such a claim over them. It is, Sir, Judy replied through their connection. Are you sure? It doesn't feel like I. Oh, sorry, he's definitely dead, Steve said before he felt a massive rush of energy in his body. Chapter 110, Yorgamont. Soul perception and soul affinity were very powerful abilities that Steve could only describe as cheating at its highest form. They not only made it impossible for anyone to hide or use any stealth skill on him, they also granted him about a third of the power belonging to whatever he killed. Inversely, he could also use it to serve as a kill confirmation skill. It is not dead, Sir, Judy suddenly spoke. Huh. Scans still detect small but mighty bits of its soul trying to escape. You only killed a husk, Judy replied. That makes sense, Steve replied before reaching out into the space before him. As soon as he did so, a small fracture could be seen as he pulled out a sword from it. The sword glowed blue and deadly. With it fully drawn, all could hear a soft ring in the air. They didn't know if this was because of its sharpness or if it was simply because of the abilities of the sword itself. With the sword in hand, Steve immediately powered in more mana into his eyes. They were his main way of sensing souls, and at the moment, it seemed that one was making a run for it. As soon as he did so, he felt a massive wave of information hit him. "You can't come here and talk big on to escape with your tail in between your legs," Steve said as he squatted over the escaping soul. It was small, almost like that of an ant, but even he could feel the might within this tiny soul. This was no normal ant soul, this was definitely that Monarch. "I curse you, human, you will." The Monarch began before Steve simply stabbed it with the sword. It was the soul-cutting sword he had made back in the Red Gate. The original may have been destroyed, but it wasn't that had to remake it. As soon as the sword touched the tiny soul, Steve felt a massive wave of not just information but energy flow through his body. This was far beyond any he had experienced before. Even Baron didn't release such an amount of power when he killed him. Title: Architect's Protégé? Pseudo-Monarch. Mana: 1.6 M. Well, that was eventful, Steve noted as he held his head and sat down on the nearby rubble. His status was displaying a level of power he had only seen in Monarch-type beings, and his mind was now filled with new information he had never heard or seen before. This world was way more sophisticated than it let on, and they were weaker than he thought. "Judy, retract the iron pagoda and begin work on a new suit. Things just got out of hand," he said after quickly sorting through what seemed to be thousands of years' worth of memories. "As you wish, Sir," Judy replied as the Tory that was once used to pin the monarch who he had found out was named Jorgamont. The monarchs are way more than he initially thought. They were gods. Eldritch gods born from the darkness as the light was made. Chapter 111, Monarchs. Baron who he had killed was the monarch of elements as Judy is now. Jorgamont is the monarch of change and mind. $K. Judy, he's not dead. Search for traces of any new gate, Steve shouted as he immediately jumped into action. It seems he had greatly underestimated the prowess of a monarch. All because of his newfound power. He had managed to overpower Baron, so he subconsciously thought the same for the rest of the monarchs. It would be just as easy. "Sir, a small gate was opened about a kilometer away from your location," Judy confirmed. "That's him for sure?" Steve asked. He didn't know why, but he felt a great deal of shame and disgrace for letting an opponent go, something he could have definitely prepared for. He had prepared for the overwhelming power, but somehow, he didn't think that someone in this world would be able to manipulate minds. "Judy, start a new project on a mind manipulation resistance tool," Steve said in a serious tone. It seems that he was becoming too relaxed in this world. From the looks of it, he needed to do better. Since his opponent had escaped him, Steve simply stood there as he looked around him. Now with clearer eyes and mind, he realized that while he had been tricked, there was still some truth in the event that just took place. He had actually beaten a monarch, well, half a monarch. Jorgamont had split himself in two almost as soon as he appeared, and somehow, he had completely forgotten about the second half. It was strange, but it seems his soul perception and soul affinity skills made it possible for his mind to reset itself as soon as all active manipulations were done. He could remember things he clearly hadn't witnessed. Speaking of remembering, Judy, did you receive any memories belonging to Baron? Steve asked based on his own weird experience just now. None, sir. However, I did receive what I would call his knowledge concerning his domain, Judy answered. I see, Steve noted before diving back into the new memories he had gained. They were a treasure trove of knowledge, and just as he expected, there were more of the monarchs, but they weren't exactly what he thought them to be. One fact: one cannot kill a monarch, they reconstitute over time. Baron was proof of that. He was the monarch of elements and bliss. As long as these things exist, then he will continue to return. As long as there was a conscious mind in the universe, Jorgamont was impossible to kill. Jorgamont was right. He had yet to see the true limits of power. Apart from the monarchs, there were also the angel-like beings known as the emissaries of God, the rulers. Monarchs, rulers, their PR teams must be dumb as shit, Steve commented as he began walking towards the main area. He would say that no one noticed his battle with Jorgamont, but unfortunately, there was a news helicopter pointing its camera towards him. He could tell even from this distance because he had created that camera. Chapter 112, Casualty. No matter how much he didn't care what the people had to say, he felt ashamed for some reason. He had made a great fool of himself today, all because he had gotten full of himself. With his head hung low, Steve returned back to the frigate. However, as soon as he appeared, he could feel all eyes on him. It was as he had guessed, the fight was broadcast for all to see, and it seemed he had made those cameras a little too good. Choosing to ignore the looks, he turned to the screen which showed the battle between the monster and the hunters. Did any of them die? Steve asked, as a frown formed on his face. No gun, he answered. Oh, good then, he replied as the frown quickly vanished. That would have been bad for his company, after claiming that the suits would increase their power by a lot and then one of the S ranks die during the mission. As for why he thought that, it was simple. A certain someone had shown up. He knew that the hunter, Jin Woo, may have rejected the offer to join in the raid. However, he also knew of the little safety measures the young hunter had in place. The problem was that he had assumed that Jin Woo would only intervene when he was sure the team had no way of dealing with the opponent, which usually was around when one person was either dead or very close to death. From what he could see in the video feed, the hunters were lying haphazardly on the ground. It was clear that the ant had done a number on them. Watching the fight between Jin Woo and the ant, Steve smiled. He didn't know why, but he felt better seeing that the monarchs were getting pushed back. He may have failed to beat Jorgamont, but they sure as hell stopped its plans on Earth. After what seemed like half an hour, the ant was dead. Jin Woo had triumphed. Yes, the entire ship erupted in celebration. Turning to Gun-hee, who was beside him, Steve could see a wide smile on the man's face. This was a victory on two fronts for him. Jeju Island has been a stain on his record, and one that he has been unable to do anything about due to his condition. The S-rank hunters present were too weak to do it all on their own. The only reason why this was a success was because Kyoto Ryaji and his team. Wait, what about the Japanese hunters? Steve asked, remembering that they had helped and borne the greatest burden. That ant killed Kyoto Ryaji, Gun-hee stated with his head down. When Steve asked, not believing it was even possible. Kyoto Ryaji was stronger than the Korean S-rank hunters, so it made no sense that he would die and the other hunters would still live. The man was stronger and was wearing one of his suits, so he couldn't wrap his head around the fact that the man was dead. It was an ambush. That creature didn't show up initially because it attacked them first, Gun-hee stated. Steve noted. More losses, and from the looks of things, a very great one to Japan at that. Kyoto Ryaji may have just been an S-rank, but he was very close to the national level. This was why the young man was pushing to raid Jeju Island as hard as he was. He wanted to use it to boost his fame well enough to officially wear that title even if he had yet to reach such a power level. Chapter 113, Clean Up. With him dead, Japan had lost one of their premier hunters. They still had more S-ranks than Korea, but Kyoto Ryaji was their strongest hunter and the one with their most powerful guild. His people are probably going to be furious about this, Steve said as he sat beside Gun-hee. His job was done, and there was no need for him to continue standing in preparation for a battle. He could leave the cleanup of the remaining monsters to the various A ranks and B ranks who were on the ships with them. This was what they came for. The event would pay well, so many had gathered to share in the spoils. Looking back up at the screens that showed the fight between Hunter Sung Jin Woo and the ant, Steve could see the battle slowly reaching its end. Jin Woo was overwhelming the beast. Did he just use telekinesis? Steve asked, surprised, as he watched the fight continue. Seconds later, they all witnessed the ant being cut into several pieces and left on the ground. This wasn't a battle from the beginning, it was a one-sided massacre. The ant stood no chance. Seeing this, a bright smile appeared on Steve's face. It seemed like he wouldn't be the only one fighting this fight. As the creature fell, Steve heard a great shout of joy erupt from the crowds, both the hunters on the ships and the watchers at home. This was a much greater moment in Korean history than he expected. Truthfully, though he wasn't allowed to deal with it as he had intended to, he was glad that things worked out well enough. With the powerful ant dead, all the hunters present immediately got to work, doing all they could to reduce the number of ants in the area. The fact that their queen and most powerful ant were dead didn't remove the danger. The ants were still incredibly dangerous. While they worked, Steve and the chairman immediately returned to the mainland via helicopter. There was no more need for them to be present. So what was that battle all about, and what were you fighting? Gun-hee asked while they were in the air. You want the truth, or what I think is the truth? Both. I could lead you through my theories, but honestly, I don't know. Apparently, there is a whole other race of beings that either control or command these monsters and the gates. Like the one on that island. Yes, Yorgamont. He has power over change and the mind. That's very vague. He has power over evolution. That amoeba probably created the monsters on Jeju Island, Steve complained. That explains why the ants evolve quickly, but is that all? Unfortunately, yes. All I know is their names and the fact that they are essentially gods, at least in terms of power. I'm yet to be sure if they are actual gods, Steve replied. He truly had yet to learn more about them. The memories he had gained from Yorgamont might shed some light on it, but he had yet to process everything fully. Chapter 114, Shopping Complex. He had simply used his abilities to hold the memories in place due to the sheer size of the information he believed he would receive from it. All he actually knew now were their names, which was the first thing that had popped into his mind as soon as he absorbed a portion of Yorgamont's split soul. If you get more information, inform me immediately, Gun-hee ordered. Naturally, by the way, the association is paying me for all this, right? Steve asked. The government is paying you for the cleanup and the barrier. Fighting Yorgamont is all on you, Gun-hee replied. Oh come on, I nearly lost my life, you know, Steve complained, but Gun-hee simply laughed. The two continued on their way, laughing at the jokes the other made. Though they might be facing an enemy they did not understand or even know the scale of, they understood that it wasn't something to lose sleep over. They knew too little, and the enemy was far too enigmatic to understand. Instead, they chose to live in the present rather than worry themselves to death. It wasn't like worrying about it would present more information. About an hour later, Steve was outside the association building as a car pulled up before him. I heard you entered a warship. I am sure that must have been exciting. A voice was heard as the door opened. Oh please, Steve replied as he rolled his eyes. Inside the car was Judy, who was dressed in a simple suit, but just a glance would easily tell anyone how expensive it was. It looked completely different from those found in the market, even with similar designs. Did anything happen while I was gone? Steve asked as he got into the car. Nothing, sir. However, you do have multiple requests to attend to, Judy replied. As expected. Anyway, let's go celebrate this win, and I think we need to speed up work on the Magi Net, Steve said. Today was a great success and one that he wanted behind him. He may have lost to that monarch, and there was a chance that information about him would be given to the other monarchs. However, in terms of information, he was way superior to them in what he now had access to. He had access to information from Yorgamont's soul, while Yorgamont only had access to information in his mind, which wasn't a lot. He had barely visited the other countries of this world, so while the monarch knew about him, it didn't know about the others, hopefully. After a few minutes of driving, they were in front of a large building. It was a shopping complex, almost no different from a regular supermarket. Judy parked the car as the two got out. Soon, the two entered the main complex. This was exactly what anyone seeing it would think. It was a large shopping complex, one that Steve had spent millions on making. However, unlike a normal shopping complex, this one had far too many hunters walking around it. Chapter 115, Weapons Contract. Business seems to be booming as I expected, Steve commented as they walked. Well, Arcane does produce the best hunter and non-hunter equipment. By the way, I think the anti-slumber drugs are ready for testing. Anti-slumber? Who gave it that name? You. Just 3 days ago, Judy replied as she chuckled. Seeing her smile, Steve couldn't help but smile himself. Judy now seemed to have completely adapted to normal human society. Her mannerisms and behaviors weren't as animated as they once were. They were all behaviors he would find in any other girl. Huh. Also, a request came in recently along with a long list of licenses. I think we just stumbled upon a big customer. Is it them? Steve asked as a smile slowly bloomed on his face. Naturally, but are you sure you are ready for this scale of production? Judy asked in a surprisingly serious tone. I am the architect, Judy. There is none more ready than I am, Steve answered. Soon after, he was inside his office reviewing the list of licenses he now had, even if he hadn't applied for them. This included a manufacturing license for firearms and ammunition from the Korean National Ministry of Defense and a registration and approval form from the Defense Acquisition Program Administration, DAPA. There were more documents contained with the request, and most were what Steve thought they would be. However, it seemed that this was coming from a much higher authority than he thought. Do they plan to create a special non-hunter force? Steve asked himself as he quickly read through each and every one of the documents. Thankfully, I have the facilities in place, he said as he dropped the last document in his hands. It was the main contract, signed by the United Nations. This was the biggest contract he had going on at the moment. So far, he had simply been making subpar equipment for the many rich clients who could access him. This was helpful and would definitely impact the world in more ways than one. Judy, Steve called out. I am here. Her voice was heard despite her obvious lack of a physical presence in the room. Do a background check. I want to be sure that this is coming from the UN, Steve ordered. As you wish, Judy replied as the office fell silent. The day went on as Steve focused on his work. Meanwhile, back on Jeju Island, the hunters alongside Jin Woo were busy killing and doing their best to clean up the remaining ants on the island. Weeks passed as Steve only got busier and busier. The anti-slumber medicine or elixirs were already on the market, and now he had apparently become a big name in the medical world as well. Mr. Grant, I can't stress enough how grateful I am, a man said as he shook Steve's hand. Mr. Yoo Myung-gon, there is no need to thank me, Steve replied. The man before him was one of his greatest investors, the chairman and founder of Yujin Construction. He hadn't noticed it before, but apparently, the man had nearly fallen to the eternal slumber. Chapter 116, Cardinon's Temple. Being humble is a good thing, but you still need to take credit when needed, another voice said as Steve turned to its source. Mr. Go Gun-hee, Steve said, greeting his friend. From the looks of things, it would seem work hasn't been treating you well, Gun-hee said with a hearty laugh. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Yoo Myung-gon, Steve said, remembering the person who had been standing before him. Don't worry, go ahead. Thank you, Steve said, giving a small bow out of respect before leaving. So what brings you here? Steve asked as he and Gun-hee began walking away. You know this is a pharmaceutical convention, Steve continued. I am well aware. However, I needed to meet with you, Gun-hee said as they both walked out of the convention center and towards the parking lot. What happened? Steve asked. It's nothing that you have to worry about. However, I thought it might be good to notify you. Don't tell me another S-rank has spawned, Steve complained. Unfortunately, yes, but, luckily it's not in Korea, Gun-hee said in a fake uplifting tone. You don't need to sugarcoat it, we both know it makes no difference. Hearing this, Steve didn't know whether to end it all. It was starting to seem as though there was always a new problem coming up every now and then. Congratulations. You have regained the honor of entering Cardinon's temple again. Do you accept? Yes, no. Okay, this is more serious than I thought, Steve whispered after seeing the new message in front of him. What? Nothing. Where did this gate open? Steve asked, knowing that he had no way of escaping this. If you will, let's move to a better place, Gun-hee suggested, gesturing towards his car. Okay, sure, he replied, slapping the hood of the car twice. Immediately after, the car started up and drove away. This action greatly surprised Gun-hee, but he had seen many things in his life. When is that one hitting the market? Gun-hee asked as the mood lightened up a bit. After all this medical craze, you know I have not slept in a week, Steve complained while Gun-hee just smiled as he listened. He understood. These were the consequences of being successful. Rather than becoming less busy, you become even more so than you imagine. The level of work may change, but it doesn't mean that you aren't busy. About 30 minutes later, the two could be seen in front of Steve's office. I thought they had about 20 S ranks. What happened to them? Steve asked. What good do you think they would be able to do? Gun-hee asked. I understand, Steve said, taking a deep breath. This entire situation seemed to be something he had no choice but to get involved in. At this point, he was beginning to doubt if any of this was actually worth it. First was the Red Gate, then Jeju Island where he met the Monarch, Jurgamund, and now the S-rank gate in London, UK. If he didn't know better, he would say that the Monarchs were pushing their invasion forward.